All right, so let me actually start by saying sorry to, I think, if I counted correctly, at least 4 people in the room, because those 4 people have heard earlier versions of this paper. I gave this paper at a conference on reconstruction in Austria, my hometown actually, in Graz, at a workshop at the Danish Royal Academy and at my own department. It's a modified version, but still, I gave the talk. Now you might wonder, well, why then are you giving it again? And that's a fair question. And to be honest with you, I just have a very pragmatic explanation for that. Usually when I'm the local organizer, I tend to not put myself on a speaker slot because I feel like, having the responsibility for, seeing that everything runs is responsibility enough. But at the same time, probably most of you have organized workshops and conferences in the past. So you well know that things happen. You have late cancellations and changes in the program, and people cancel their trips and all these kinds of things. And this was exactly what happened. And pretty late in the process, we ended up with a glaring hole pretty much in the middle of the workshop. And we thought, like, the least disruptive way to actually deal with that problem is, for Harald to talk about Bohr, because who doesn't like Bohr? I actually even have evidence in my talk that everyone loves Bohr. That's the final part. That's the grand finale. I should also mention that the material for this talk came out from a graduate course at Stanford last year, together with Tom Reichman. And I'm mentioning this because I learned a tremendous lot from Tom, not only about Bohr in general. I feel deeply indebted, and as you will see, our views are not that different. I think we share a common perspective of how we think we should best make sense of what Bohr is writing and saying about quantum mechanics. The difference maybe is a little bit that, last time I talked to Tom is a couple of months ago. He gave the talk at Pittsburgh. I don't know if his views changed in the meantime. What I can say is that I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic about the attainability and the viability of this kind of reading of Bohr I'm going to propose. As you will see, most of the paper is in a more critical spirit. That being said, what is it actually I want to talk about? Well, I want to talk about the specific reading of Bohr, namely to read Bohr as a transcendental thinker about quantum mechanics. And in that spirit, the structure of my talk looks like this. Given the fact that we're talking about a transcendental perspective on physics and quantum mechanics in particular, the obvious question to start with, of course, is what actually do we mean with this word transcendental? What does it mean to approach physics and quantum mechanics in particular from a transcendental perspective? And this is what I want to address in the first part of my talk. In the second part, I want to talk about one specific way in which you can be a transcendentalist about quantum mechanics, and that is the kind of position I think Bohr wants to express in his writings on quantum mechanics. And then I will come to the critical part of my talk, and I want to address what I perceive as the maybe biggest problem in such an approach. And I don't think there's a good solution to it, at least not if we want to stick to the original Bohrian program, the way at least I see it. And then the proof for the popularity of Bohr. Okay, so without much further ado, let's go straight to business. So let's talk about this word transcendental. And of course, if we talk about what the word transcendental means, we should go back to the philosopher who put this word on the philosophical map. So let's start with 2 quotes from Immanuel Kant and then one quote from Nikolai Hartmann, kind of a neo-Kantian, well, not quite, but close enough. end of 19th century, early 20th century. So first, from Critique of Pure Reason, I call transcendental all knowledge which is occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of a knowledge of objects, insofar as this mode is to be possible a priori. And the second one, the word transcendental does not signify something passing beyond all experience, but something that indeed precedes it a priori, but that is intended simply to make knowledge of experience possible. This is a formulation that will come up a lot in the next 30 minutes or so. I'm sorry for that. And then Nikolai Hartmann, the transcendental method is the procedure according to which, beginning from the reality of an object, one can infer the conditions of the possibility. All right, so what do we have here? So starting from de facto experience, starting from a given body of knowledge, the transcendental analysis aspires to kind of work backwards, to unearth in this kind of regressive mode, to identify what the necessary conditions of the possibility of this kind of experience, of this given body of knowledge. And to just, you know, with a very blunt example, get a couple of first intuitions flowing. I mean, for all intents and purposes, in normal situations, we think of ourselves as competent observers, in the sense that typically we feel like we're pretty good in distinguishing between actual physical objects, the table over there, from, say, figments of our imagination, the pink elephant I see currently dancing in that corner of the room, for instance. But doing so, of course, presupposes something. It presupposes a certain concept, a certain notion of objectivity. And as a first approximation, we can say transcendental analysis is in the business of spelling this concept out. But of course, I mean, these are examples, life-world examples. These are examples taken from the manifest image. We're talking about chairs, tables, elephants, cars, and so on and so on. But there is no deeper reason why it needs to be restricted to that realm. The transcendental project, of course, can be extended. For instance, here, quote by Michel Bebol, Pierre Kersberg, and Jean Petitot, elaborating a transcendental epistemology of physics means to undertake a reflective research about the indispensable preconditions of our knowledge and their relevance to the structure of physical theories. So basically, it's the same idea. It's this idea of unearthing the necessary conditions of the possibility of that kind of experience and knowledge, but now with this special focus on the realm of physical theories. Or in a similar vein, Sunny or Young, until now, almost all philosophical investigations of quantum theories have either taken the concept of objectivity for granted or prescribed it as some external criterion according to which the theories are judged. I adopt the opposite approach. I start with the premise that quantum theory conveys knowledge of the microscopic worlds and regard these general meanings of object as a question whose answer lies within the theory. This work asks quantum theory to demonstrate its own objectivity by extracting and articulating the general concept of objects it embodies. What general conditions hold for us in the world we are in, so that objects, classical and quantum, which are knowable through observations and experiments, constitute reality. How is knowledge of the quantum world possible? These are part of what Kant asked: how is empirical knowledge in general possible? So let me quickly summarize. And of course, I'm barely scratching the surface. I'm really trying to give the short summary. Transcendental analysis, and the way I will use the notion in the following, is first of all a regressive undertaking in which we start from given experience, given body of knowledge, in order to then, in a second step, unveil the necessary conditions of the possibility of this kind of experience or body of knowledge. This is the rough working notion of transcendental I will work with in the following, but let me make 3 additional remarks now, and mostly I'm now flagging a couple of issues to which I will return in the course of the talk. But I think already now it's important to mention the following things. First, there is, of course, an important epistemological lesson and implication in all of this. I mean, the short version, and this will come out more clearly, is that experience, if you buy into such a picture, is of course not just passive registering of data. Because in order for experience in any meaningful way to occur at all, these transcendental structures, whatever they might be in the end, must already be in place. So to come back to this example from before, to competently distinguish between a physical object and a figment of imagination, a concept of objectivity must already be operative. The second thing is, and again, this sounds maybe awfully abstract, but I will come back to this. There is a specific relationship between the level of concrete experience on the one hand and the necessary conditions of the possibility preceding it. And the short version of the story is, if X is a necessary condition of the possibility and thus constitutive for the body of knowledge Y, then on pain of circularity, we cannot rely on Y to account for X. This is the short version of the Kantian argument against naturalized epistemology, and we will see how that actually plays a role in what I think is a viable reading of Bohr, namely a transcendental reading. And this is seen to be a logical point. And of course, we can now discuss differences between the original Kantian project and how neo-Kantians tried to make sense of this. But I think for the systematic point I want to make, these more historical exegetical differences do not matter so much. I will come back to this. And the third point, which is important, is that we need to be cautious with the notion of necessity we're working with in this necessary conditions of the possibility. And there is a long historical story to this, and I don't have time to go into this because this has to do with how Kant was originally thinking in the Critique of Pure Reason about this project to deliver the philosophical foundation for Newtonian classical physics, and how the ideas of absolute space and time were considered to be the necessary conditions of possibility of spatial experience of any kind. What the relativistic revolution in 1905 and 1915 meant for the original Kantian project, how the neo-Kantians responded to this long, interesting story. But the important thing for us is contemporary transcendentalists post-Einstein would typically work with a notion of conditional necessity. And here is one definition for that, again, with Bohr, Herzberg, and Petitot. Certain constitutive principles are necessary under the condition that a certain practice of research is implemented. And when these practices of research change, and if we look into science history, we know they do, then of course the constitutive principles may change, and as a matter of fact, do change too. So this concludes the first part of the talk. Now let me go to Bohr. So I think a good way to start is to point to a crucial idealization in classical physics, namely the one that concerns the possibility of ideal measurements, so measurements that do not alter the state of a measured system. Although we know that actual measurements do not and do never live up to this ideal. I mean, think about trying to measure the pressure in your car tire and you know what you just did. Classical physics treats this as a contingent matter of technological realizability. So would we have these better ideal technological means, we could actually achieve this ideal notion. Bohr considered Planck's discovery of the universal quantum of action h bar pretty much as the essence of quantum mechanics, exactly because it undermines this notion of an ideal measurement. So h bar connects the properties of particles, energy and momentum, to properties of waves, frequency and wavelengths, for these two equations. And from this, it follows first that the value of physical properties like radiation or energy cannot come in infinitely small amounts, but is always quantized. And second, and contra non-disturbance, measurement interactions can never be neglected in quantum mechanics. Since h bar is finite in size, any measurement interaction is at best of the same order of magnitude as the interactions it is supposed to measure. And to quite a few of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, this had far-reaching epistemological implications. So here, for instance, Werner Heisenberg, what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to a method of questioning. Or in Bohr's work, we must accept the fact of a fundamental, quote, inseparability of knowledge and our possibilities of inquiry. And of course, this must be taken very seriously. I mean, there are these passages in Bohr where it's very clear that it makes no sense, for instance, to say that we are disturbing or creating a phenomenon by virtue of doing an observation in quantum mechanics. And the reason is that words like disturb or create kind of impose this ontological picture, an ontological judgment about the system pre-observation. So the kind of ontological judgment that's imposed is that there is or isn't something that can then be disturbed or created by an act of observation. But this inseparability of knowledge and our possibilities of inquiry means that such kind of pre-observation talk is meaningless. There are, of course, many things people found puzzling about Bohr, and one issue in particular was this insistence that the, quote, description of the experimental arrangement and the recording of observation must be given in plain language. So basically, what this means is no matter how far quantum mechanics departs from classical physics, the description of the experimental setups must always be given classically. So, quote, the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics merely offers rules of calculation for the deduction of expectations about observations obtained under well-defined experimental conditions specified by classical physical concepts. And this is true even in the case where we make the experimental setup part of the quantum description, which of course we can choose to do, because even then, quote, some ultimate measuring instruments, like the scales and clocks, which determine the frame of space-time coordination, must always be described entirely on classical lines and consequently kept outside the system subject to quantum mechanical treatment. And this has been perceived as a sharp rift between quantum and classical. And this puzzled many because it really seems to leave us with two equally unattractive options. And I will not go into any of the details connected to these discussions because there is enough literature on that. What I want to say is, on the one hand, there seems to be the option of accepting a kind of a two-world ontology, where on the one hand, you have the ontological realm of the quantum, the small stuff, and then you have the classical realm, the macroscopic stuff. But against such an interpretation, this is just one possible argument, but I think it's a pretty strong one, is that Bohr himself is very clear that the line between quantum and classical is to be drawn arbitrarily. It's to be drawn on the basis of pragmatic considerations. And if that's the case, how can we assume that there is a deep ontological rift if at the same time it's a pragmatic question where to actually introduce the line? The other option would be to read Bohr along classical instrumentalist lines. And then depending on how you think about instrumentalism, this could, for instance, mean to suggest really something like from Frasen's style epistemic agnosticism regarding the quantum realm. And again, I will not go into any of the details, but there is much in Bohr that quite clearly goes against such a quantum agnosticism. I mean, at the very least, according to Bohr, quantum mechanics embodies an epistemology that concerns, quote, what we can say about quantum nature. Again, I will not go into any of the discussions regarding these two options. What I want to say and what my point about this is is that it's exactly at this juncture that a transcendental perspective offers a third option between these two equally unattractive options. And let me quote Michel Bibol, who expresses this third option in a quite clear way. Just as Kant did, Bohr undertook a reflective analysis of the generic structure of our capability to know. However, unlike Kant, Bohr distanced himself from a study of mental faculties, such as sensibility and understanding. He rather focused on a technological counterpart of sensibility, namely the measurement apparatus, and on the intersubjective counterpart of understanding, which is common language. So the basic idea here is that Bohr considered the experimental setup and the common language, even though in the following I will focus on the experimental side of things, as the necessary condition of the possibility of quantum experience in a transcendental sense of the term. And for the overall interpretation of Bohr, this has three main consequences. The first one is, so if experimental setups are necessary conditions, the possibility for quantum experience, then it follows quite naturally within the transcendental logic that there is no meaningful pre-observation discourse. To engage in such a discourse, to stay within the Kantian terminology, is really to commit a transcendental illusion. It is speculative metaphysics that really oversteps the boundaries of possible experience and its relationship to the conditions of its existence. And to a certain extent, I would say that this fits very well with Bohr's definition of what it actually means to talk about a phenomenon, what a phenomenon is. Quote, I strongly advocate limitation of the use of the word phenomenon to refer exclusively to observations obtained under specific circumstances, including an account of the whole experiment. Second, so if you think of experimental setups as necessary conditions of the possibility of quantum experience, then the fact that they must be described classically does not have any ontological implications whatsoever. And again, I want to quote Michel Bibol, there is nothing in the physical nature of macroscopic objects that distinguishes them from the macroscopic ones, and which rules out the possibility of describing them as quantum systems. Bohr's concern is rather to emphasize the specific function that the measuring apparatuses accomplish in the system of knowledge, that of fulfilling a condition of the possibility of objective experience. And again, this connects to Kant's definition of transcendental as being occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of our knowledge of objects. And this, as a consequence, also explains why introducing an experimental setup is both necessary, while it's at the same time completely arbitrary where exactly one draws the quantum classical line. So although the scope of quantum mechanics is unrestricted, you need to introduce an experimental setup somewhere, because introducing the setup is the necessary condition of the possibility to have quantum experience at all. And this is, in a way, reminiscent of a quite famous quote by Asher Paris in Zurich, which for a long time I found quite obscure, but looking at it from this transcendental perspective, I think it makes perfect sense. Although quantum theory is universal, it is not closed. Anything can be described in it, but something must remain unanalyzed. Although it can describe anything, a quantum description cannot include everything. The last point here, and this is connected to what I just said in the previous second point. Remember Bohr's remark that some ultimate measuring instruments must always be described entirely on classical lines and consequently kept outside the system subject to quantum mechanical treatment. And this is exactly the point to which I was alluding to at the beginning when I was talking about what it actually means to talk or to use this word transcendental. that the measuring instruments must remain outside the quantum description is a purely logical point. So if X is a necessary condition of the possibility for Y, X cannot be accounted for within Y. And this is really this version of the traditional Kantian argument against naturalized epistemology. So if we're talking about epistemology more broadly, if you think of epistemology as dealing with the question, how is empirical knowledge possible, then it is simply self-defeating to rely on empirical knowledge to answer this question in its entirety. So I'm now coming to the critical part. Let me first say that I do think that there are many passages in Bohr which, at least to my reading, seem to fit perfectly well into this overall interpretational framework. I think Bohr repeatedly uses a Kantian language when he refers, for instance, to the measuring instruments as the conditions under which the phenomena appear. And I think we can give a long list of expressions that, at the very least, have a quite distinctive Kantian ring to them. Then there is the additional historical discussion about the influence of Harald Höfting on Bohr and the personal friendship they had. But there are definitely people much more competent with the historical details to say something about this. What I want to focus more is the systematic level, because here I think that to the mind of some, this kind of Bohrian brand of transcendentalism really might be something that offers the best of two worlds. I mean, on the one hand, it gives you this kind of epistemologically much more nuanced picture of really quantum experience is much more than just passive registering of data, and how you can think about common language and experimental setups as necessary conditions of possibility in order for having that kind of experience. But on the other hand, and in contradistinction to Kant himself, there is no reference to mental faculties or the subject more generally. I will come back to this point at the end of my talk. And this might really seem to be something which is quite desirable, especially if you think that a well-behaved theory, to use Tim Maudlin's term, is really one which is purged from all operational, subjective, experiential notions and the concept of a subject more generally. But I think there are problems with this. And the problem I want to talk about is the following one. So again, why is it exactly that the final experimental setup is considered the necessary condition of the possibility for having any experimental contact with the quantum realm? The reasoning seems to be that the final experimental setup enjoys this special status because simply there wouldn't be any quantum experience if this final experimental setup was implemented. And this is also the reason why the final experimental setup falls outside the scope of a quantum description. But my main worry, and this is really the core of the argument, if you follow this criterion, I think the danger is really that there are many more things, unwanted things, that deserve to be called necessary conditions of the possibility for quantum experience. And let me illustrate by means of an example what I mean with this. So again, final experimental setup enjoys this special status of a necessary condition of the possibility for quantum experience because there wouldn't be any such experience if the experimental setup hadn't been put in place first. But on the assumption that the outcome of the final measurement apparatus must, for instance, be registered by a human observer, there wouldn't also be any quantum experience if, for instance, the lab wasn't filled with sufficient amount of air. But I mean, does it make sense to refer to a sufficient amount of air in a lab as a necessary condition of the possibility? I mean, would it then in extension make sense to deny that you can address or talk about or analyze this oxygen in the lab within quantum mechanics? And I assume that we all agree that the answer is no, this is an absurd consequence, and I take it that Bohr would also agree. But the problem really is I don't see any room in the Bohrian account to distinguish, on the one hand, between the experimental setup and something like, let's call it purely contingent, and for that reason, epistemically irrelevant background conditions, like, for instance, air in the lab, on the other hand. And this, just by the way, argument does not, of course, depend on introducing human observers in this argument, or specifically talking about oxygen. I mean, you just need to replace air in the lab with, for instance, being located on a terrestrial instead of a gas planet, and pretty much the argument works in the same way. Now, are there possible Bohrian responses to this? Yes, of course there are. I mean, one response would be this. You could say, well, you know what, in a way, it is correct to say that every event is somehow causally linked to everything else in the event's past light cone. But whether a particular condition just happens to be in an event's past light cone or is necessary for the possibility of the event's occurrence is basically just like everything else, a scientific matter, which you can only decide by looking at the relevant science, and in this case, quantum mechanics itself. But if the general claim is true that there is a transcendental moment in Bohr's argumentation, then I don't think that this argumentative strategy is available to Bohr at all. Why is that the case? Well, I mean, remember what I said about the relationship between experience on the one hand and necessary conditions of the possibility for that experience that precede the experience. I said, like, if X is a transcendentally necessary condition for Y, then on pain of self-defeat, we cannot rely on Y to account for X. But if we were to depend on quantum mechanics to identify the conditions that are transcendentally necessary for the possibility of quantum experience, then we would be self-defeating in exactly this way. We would commit the fallacy of analyzing the transcendentally necessary conditions within the very framework for which they are constitutive. The other possible solution to the problem would be this. I mean, remember what I said about the notion of necessary that is typically used by contemporary transcendentalists. So this is the definition of a conditional necessity, terms a necessity that depends on the implementation of a certain practice of research. And if you work with this definition, you could argue as follows. Well, whether X is a necessary condition of the possibility in the transcendental sense of the term depends on whether X is part of a distinctive practice that must be carried out in order to achieve a certain epistemic end. So you could say arranging measurement apparatuses in a specific manner is a practice that serves a certain epistemic end, but having air in the lab or being on a terrestrial planet are not connected in any obvious way to such epistemic practices. But this is also something I don't think is available for Bohr. If you connect the notion of necessary conditions of the possibility with specific research practices, and thus with specific epistemic goals, what's effectively happening is that you're smuggling an epistemic agent and hence a conscious subject into the description of quantum mechanics. And while I'm not denying that this might be perfectly reasonable, I'm a phenomenologist, I don't think that this is part of what Bohr's official agenda includes. So this is a point where Michel Pipol and I disagree quite fundamentally about how to read Bohr, because Michel has different ideas about that. But I agree with the majority of people reading and commenting on Bohr that whenever Bohr talks about experience or observers or anything like this, his references to, quote, Jan Fay, refer to the observer qua physical system, not qua consciousness, or as Don Howard expresses this, that Bohr was always careful to physicalize the observer. And here just two additional quotes that corroborate this interpretation of Bohr. Since in philosophical literature, reference is sometimes made to different levels of objectivity or subjectivity, or even of reality, it may be stressed that the notion of an ultimate subject finds no place in an objective description as we have defined it. Second one, description of atomic phenomena has in these respects a perfectly objective character in the sense that no explicit reference is made to any individual observer. Hence, my challenge, there is no way to distinguish between necessary conditions of the possibility in an epistemically interesting sense of the term and purely contingent background conditions like air in the lab or being located on a terrestrial planet. But now the important part. It's starting. And I have no sound. This is so disappointing. Sorry. Oh, that's real. I think I have to step out of the Zoom for, is this possible? No. Can I have sound with this?
Turn your mic off. Yeah, there won't be an echo. You could play it. Turn the mic.
So what do I need to do?
Turn the mic off. Turn the mic off.
This one here. Okay.
Zoom mic.
Okay. Oh, my grand finale is going down the train. This is so sad. Do you know the scene, Guido, right? From The Simpsons, no?
I'm muted now, yeah.
This one?
Also.
Okay, like so.
Muted.
We are creating suspense.
You should mute yourself now. In Zoom. I have no idea. You're still gonna get pick up from.
Okay, are you ready?
Tonight, when dinosaurs get drunk. Oh,
You're not seeing the screen? Now?
tonight, when dinosaurs get drunk.
Oh, I've been there, man.
Has been canceled. Instead, we bring you the boring world of Niels Bohr.
Well, thank you, Harald, for this amazing talk. Questions?
Thank you. It's echoing again.
So, does it work now?
Let's see. It
Yes,
does.
right.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Actually, two questions. One is, what
Sure.
do you mean by this logical? You mentioned the logical, and I never really understood what kind of logic is behind this, because it's obviously not what you study in mathematics from logic. It's not
No.
a nomological kind of necessity. Is it a metaphysical necessity? And if so, what kind of necessity? The second question is, how do you identify this necessary condition for the possibility? Don't you need some empirical support from say, the neurophysiological sciences or something like that. Otherwise, it seems that you are immunizing your account from any possible criticism, because any criticism presupposes your account.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, to a certain extent, these two questions are, of course, connected to each other. I mean, I think to embrace the general transcendental framework means to think of, you need to have these necessary conditions of the possibility in place in order to then have any kind of meaningful experience within that framework. So whatever, I mean, to a certain extent, the logic is quite similar to what you find, I don't know, for instance, in late Carnap, the distinction between internal questions and external questions. Do primes exist? Well, show me the rules of mathematics, and then it's a simple answer. Yes, of course, given those rules. If you don't have these rules in place, well, then it's simply a meaningless question to start with. I don't know how to answer it. So, no?
Yeah, that's a semantic. I mean, you can clarify with some sort of semantic conditions to define certain language. Right?
Yeah, I mean, whether we talk about semantics here or if it's more an epistemological point of having to have certain necessary conditions of the possibility in place in order to then know how to specify how you talk within that framework. I mean, you can specify this or you can analyze this as semantic, but you don't have to. I would say it's a much more fundamental epistemological point that in order to speak meaningfully, you need to specify the rules, what, for instance, it means to, I don't know, talk objectively about things. I mean, think of how, for instance, Cassirer interprets the principle of covariance. It doesn't say anything about the world. It just specifies what within a certain theoretical framework. Exactly. And in pretty much this way, I would say any plausible version of neo-Kantianism would think about this matter. Now, how you want to specify in which sense this is a logical point is a good question that I'm not sure if I have a... Yeah, well, then this is a job we should do.
Kant talks about logic, but never clarifies.
Yes. No, but I mean, for the context of this discussion, I mean, there are a couple of things. First of all, I mean, the claim I'm making here is a quite minimal one. I think that this is a plausible way to read Bohr. I'm not necessarily committing myself to this view. That's the first thing. The second thing, I agree with you that one needs to spell out in which sense this is a logical point. And of course, it's not a standard meaning of logical, but the general idea that you need to specify the rules in order to then know how to understand any kind of statement or utterance being made, that seems to me pretty intuitive.
Sorry, I don't.
Sure.
We can talk
Yeah.
about this.
Thank you, Harald. My question is, my remark is about your claim that there is a kind of circularity in the idea that to refer to necessary conditions of experience, you use the theory that you are trying to justify in a transcendental way. So I was thinking that we might say that through physical theory, we somehow discover that there are necessary conditions, but this is only a step toward this kind of discovery. So that at that point, we need not argue that those conditions strongly depend on the theory. We discover through the theory, but this does not commit us to think that those conditions are part of the theory exactly like other more ordinary parts of the theory.
I mean, there are two. Yeah, I mean, no, I get what you're saying. And I think it's to a certain extent a matter of graduality. It's definitely not an either or issue. I mean, those of you who know me know that there aren't many things I like about Heidegger, But there is one thing in Heidegger, and this is also where I think you find a notion of a transcendental argument in Heidegger, is this idea that in order to engage in any kind of epistemic undertaking, the first step is to what Heidegger calls to throw a project, which just basically means, for instance, if you are partaking in this idea of, or in this endeavor of epistemology, how it's usually understood in the Western tradition, you introduce this basic distinction between a subject and then a world, and then you have to clarify what the kind of relationship between the two is. In order to play this specific language game in any meaningful way, you first have to throw this project in that specific way. You have to introduce this basic distinction. If you don't do this, you can simply not play this kind of epistemology game. And I think this basic assumption in transcendental analysis is one where really this argument becomes quite forceful. That in order to have any kind of scientific conversation about which kinds of conditions play which kind of role on your specific cognitive abilities, presuppose ultimately on throwing a project in a specific way. But then you cannot talk within the project you have such created on this act of throwing a project. But that does not mean that, for instance, any kind of, whatever we can learn from the cognitive sciences, for instance, have no impact whatsoever on how we understand how we are getting cognitively in contact with the world. But this ultimate step of throwing this project is something which cannot be analyzed and thematized within this kind of framework you have created in that. It is a categorical mistake, yeah.
This is a question for all the Boreans in the audience, not just Harald.
So I can just deflect.
You can try to deflect if you're allowed to by the other Boreans in the room. I'm curious what Bohr's reaction was to relativity theory and the synthetic and the category of Euclidean geometry as synthetic a priori. And the question is relevant because a lot of neo-Kantian people are thinking about this at the time. Cassirer, of course, was supremely concerned and interested in this issue.
Yes.
And they came up with a new notion, really, of the synthetic a priori, which is both contingent and historicized and relative.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, did Bohr think about this? If he was a Kantian of this sort, he must have worried a lot about this. Did he write about Euclidean geometry as a condition of experience and why that fared in the advent of relativity theory? Is there anywhere where he writes about that? And this is just a curious question of
thank you.
scholarship, so you may not be able to answer it. Someone else in the audience may.
Exactly. So I'm happy to deflect. I'm not sure. But I mean, on a more systematic level, I mean, the very point of this understanding of being a transcendentalist about physics and then in particular quantum mechanics would be to say that classical physics, classical language and the experimental apparatuses which we have are the conditions of the possibility of having this kind of quantum experience simply because of the creatures we are. And to a certain extent, that already is to a certain extent, well, maybe not historization. I mean, it depends a little bit on how you think who we are as creatures, really. Are we also part of a kind of a historical evolution that has to do with, Darwinian pressure and so on and so on? So to a certain extent, I mean, I would say on a systematic level, I see a connection there. Whether historically he did interact, for instance, I don't know how much Harald Höftin did know about Cassirer. I have no idea if there is a connection, because Harald Höftin, as far as I know, historically, was the main influence for Bohr's knowledge about a specific kind of neo-Kantianism. But whether that included Cassirer, I have no idea.
I mention this also because what Bohr says about the classical world
and the necessity of the classical Bohr doesn't sound to me very contingent to results. I mean, it seems to think that this is a really logical necessary condition on any possible point of experience to be able to describe experimental setup in classical parts.
Well, I mean,
I don't think a seer would ever have used such an axiom.
no, I mean, the basic logic, the connection between the necessary conditions of the possibility and what they precede and the kind of experience they're making possible, that is a logical point. But whatever the conditions of possibility are, that is then made contingent. And you might just say, like, to a certain extent, this is similar in phenomenology. You would also say what the life world is from which we start, and this could be another similarity to Bohr, is to a certain extent, of course, first of all, historical. What the life world is for us in the 21st century is different from what the life world was for people in medieval times, for instance. And second of all, it is also contingent to a certain extent on our physiological makeup, on certain biological presuppositions, these kinds of things. But the logic regarding the relation between these two levels, necessary conditions of the possibility on the one hand, and the experience that they allow for, that is a logical point. But how you fill these up, this is a matter of historical evolution, and to that extent contingent. And about the historical part, I simply don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. Thanks, Harold. So I have a question about the problem of distinguishing, the relevant conditions of an experimental setup from the purely contingent or accidental sort of super background conditions. And I guess I'm wondering, I sort of have just an off-the-cuff proposal for a way of distinguishing those things in a principled way. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of highlight why that's probably wrong, or if it suffers from some similar problems. So what about just a straightforward sort of counterfactual test, right? So would this experiment work if there was no air in the room? And if so, then there being air is not a relevant necessary condition. And so I'm wondering, is that proposal susceptible to the same sort of problem as the kind of relevant research practice proposal? Does it have different problems?
No, thank you. I mean, no, but the thing is, I mean, the counterfactual strategy is involved in talking about the necessary conditions of the possibility in any case. The challenge is to pick out the right ones. I think that is the challenge. And this is where I don't quite see in this framework where you have the criterion in order to decide which ones are the epistemically relevant ones and which ones are just, garden variety background conditions which are not epistemically relevant in any meaningful sense. I think that is the challenge.
Okay, so
but I mean, in any
that's like too wide a net, really.
It's exactly, there is too much room to be admissible in which what you allow for your counterfactual analysis. You can't really draw an epistemically meaningful line between what's in that sense relevant and what isn't. I think that's the issue.
I think we no longer have time for other questions. We maybe can go on over the after break later. So let's thank Harald.
Thank you.